On the morning of November 8, 1849, the body of a cotton trader named Josiah Pitton was discovered inside a tobacco barn just outside Natchez, Mississippi. His overseer found him at daybreak, swinging from a support beam, a noose tight around his neck. The local sheriff quickly closed the case as a suicide, citing recent financial setbacks and a despondent mood. The official record was finalized, the corpse interred, and the world moved on. Yet, what the sheriff deliberately overlooked was the hemp rope, binding Pitton's hands behind his back. A man cannot hang himself with his wrists tied. Someone had staged his execution to mimic self-destruction, and this executioner had performed this act before, many times. Between 1832 and 1863, scattered across 5 southern states, a minimum of 250 white men perished under circumstances that either baffled authorities or were deliberately left unexplored. Plantation owners, overseers, patrollers, county sheriffs, federal marshals, and wealthy merchants, all enriched by human bondage, met their ends. Some were found hanging in barns with their hands inexplicably bound. Others were discovered face down in shallow creeks, in water too shallow to cause drowning. Many simply vanished, their horses found wandering, their weapons untouched, and their bodies never recovered. Spanning 3 decades and covering territory from Virginia to Louisiana, no official pattern was ever recognized. No investigation ever linked the incidents, and no arrests were ever made. However, hidden away in courthouse basements, within private letters, plantation ledgers, and the oral histories passed down by the formerly enslaved, a name is persistently whispered, never inscribed in any official document. It belongs to a man who could navigate the antebellum South like a wisp of smoke, who could vanish into a crowd of enslaved laborers and become utterly invisible. He understood that the very system that held him in chains had created its own fatal flaws. He learned to exploit those vulnerabilities with surgical accuracy. He killed without pity and disappeared without a trace. They called him Moses, not solely for leading people to freedom, though some claim he did that as well, but because, akin to his biblical namesake, he was the angel of death, passing over Egypt and every firstborn son of the Pharaoh's fury. Before I reveal his story, before I present the evidence that historians have spent over 150 years attempting to suppress, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Litany of Shadows right now and hit that notification bell, because what you are about to hear will utterly dismantle everything you were taught about slavery in school. The sanitized version, the one that depicts enslaved people as passive victims awaiting white saviors to rescue them. The truth is far more intricate, far more brutal, and far more empowering than anyone wants to admit. Drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from, and let's begin. This narrative doesn't start with violence, but with a transaction. On August 17, 1832, at the slave market in Richmond, Virginia, under a humid, suffocating morning sky, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and fear, a man of about 28 stood on the auction block. The auctioneer's ledger listed him simply as Daniel, prime field hand, strong back, no defects, some resistance noted. That final phrase should have served as a warning. But the buyer, a tobacco planter named Marcus Whitfield, saw only a powerful physique and paid $950 for him, taking the man in chains to a plantation 40 miles west of Richmond. That plantation was Ashford, a sprawling 200-acre tobacco estate worked by 180 enslaved individuals and ruled by 7 overseers through systematic terror. Whitfield, who rarely interfered in daily operations, lived in the big house, managed his accounts, and entertained guests, leaving the brutal mechanics of forced labor to his subordinates. He fancied himself a businessman, not a slaver. He was mistaken on both accounts. The man, purchased as Daniel, arrived at Ashford on August 20, 1832, alongside 4 others from the same auction. They were processed like livestock, stripped, examined, assigned numbers, given rough clothing, and marched to the quarters, a cluster of wooden shacks that housed enslaved families in conditions that would have been unfit for livestock. Daniel was placed in the first gang, the highest tier of field workers, reserved for the strongest men. The work was relentless. Tobacco demanded constant care, planting, weeding, pruning, topping to force energy into the leaves, harvesting, curing, stripping, and packing. The labor stretched from before sunrise to long after sunset. To enforce productivity, overseers wielded violence without restraint. A man working too slowly received the lash. One who talked back faced far worse. One who attempted escape and was caught suffered a public spectacle designed to break both body and spirit. For the first 3 months, Daniel did precisely what was expected. He worked in silence, kept his gaze down, consumed his meager rations of cornmeal and fatback, and slept in his assigned corner of the quarters. He showed no emotion, no personality, and gave the overseers nothing to remember him by. He was just another body in the fields, indistinguishable from the dozens of other men bent over the tobacco rows. But Daniel was engaged in an activity the overseers couldn't perceive he was learning. Every day, he memorized more. The layout of the plantation, its blind spots, the patrol routes, the overseers' schedules, which men were heavy drinkers and which stayed alert, the property boundaries, which roads led where, and the operations of the local slave patrols. He learned the sounds of Ashford, the routine noises of normal operations versus the urgent sounds of trouble. He mastered moving without sound, being present without being noticed, fading into the background while absorbing everything. And he waited. On November 23, 1832, exactly 3 months after Daniel's arrival, the first overseer died. He was William Cobb, a 6-year veteran of Ashford, known for carrying a hickory cane to strike workers across the backs of their legs. A punishment that inflicted agony without leaving visible marks that would reduce a slave's value. Cobb's body was found in one of the tobacco curing barns at dawn. He'd been working late, monitoring the temperature and humidity levels necessary for curing thousands of hanging tobacco leaves. According to the report filed by Marcus Whitfield, Cobb had apparently fallen from one of the upper racks, a 15-foot drop that broke his neck. The plantation physician, Dr. Hastings, confirmed a broken neck consistent with a fall. Some bruises on Cobb's arms and torso were attributed to the impact, and no one questioned the conclusion. Falls were common, barns were dangerous in the dark. Cobb was buried in the plantation cemetery, and Whitfield had a new overseer hired within a week. What Hastings failed to note, and what he chose not to investigate too closely, was that the bruises on Cobb's arms were fingertip-shaped, the kind left by someone gripping with immense force. He also didn't examine Cobb's pockets, where a small piece of cloth had been stuffed, a torn fragment from a slave's shirt. A message, though no one yet understood its meaning. For 4 months, nothing unusual occurred at Ashford. The new overseer, a man named Peterson, settled into his duties. The tobacco was harvested, cured, and sold, and Whitfield reaped excellent profits that season. Life continued its brutal routine. Then, on March 14, 1833, Peterson vanished. He had left the main house after dinner, telling the other overseers he was going to inspect the quarters before turning in. He carried a lantern and a pistol. He never returned. A search party formed at dawn when Peterson failed to appear for breakfast. They combed the plantation, the quarters, the fields, the woods, the tobacco barns, the roads. Every enslaved person was questioned. Dogs were brought in, but they followed a trail from the main house toward the quarters, only to lose it near an irrigation ditch. For 3 days, They dragged the ditches, searched every building, and sent riders to neighboring plantations. Nothing. Peterson had vanished as if he had never existed. His pistol and lantern were never found. Whitfield reported the disappearance to the county sheriff, who launched his own investigation but found no answers. Some suggested gambling debts, others, a drunken fall into a ditch, his body swept away by the current. A few whispered that a slave had killed him, but without evidence. The theory led nowhere. The case remained unsolved. Whitfield hired another replacement, a man named Dutch, who had experience on South Carolina plantations and came with strong recommendations. But in the slave quarters, in conversations held after dark in languages and codes the overseers couldn't understand, people were talking. A woman named Sarah mentioned she'd seen Daniel returning to his cabin late one night with wet clothes, around the time Peterson disappeared. A man named Joseph said he'd noticed Daniel watching Peterson with unsettling focus for days before the disappearance. None of them reported these observations to the authorities, knowing it would mean torture and likely death. Instead, a quiet understanding began spreading through the Ashford enslaved community. Someone was fighting back, and that someone was careful, patient, and methodical. On June 2, 1833, Dutch died in broad daylight. He was supervising a work gang in a distant tobacco field, a quarter-mile from the main buildings, under the fierce mid-morning sun. He was standing at the field's edge when he suddenly collapsed, grabbing his throat, his face turning red, then purple. He fell to his knees, gasping, clawing at his neck, and within 2 minutes he was dead. The physician, Dr. Hastings, was summoned and examined the body in the field. He concluded it was heart failure, likely brought on by heat and drinking. But one of the enslaved workers, a young man named Thomas, noticed something the physician missed. Dutch's water flask, hanging on his belt, smelled wrong, not like water, but bitter, as if it contained something it shouldn't. Thomas said nothing, but that night, he told others what he'd observed, and the understanding deepened. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidents. This was war. A war being waged by one man who had discovered that a world built on violence could see that violence flow in both directions. He learned that masters who saw their slaves as invisible had made themselves vulnerable to an invisible threat. 3 overseers dead in 7 months. And Daniel, quiet Daniel, who never caused trouble and seemed to dissolve into the background, was still there, still working, still watching, still waiting for his next opportunity. Marcus Whitfield was beginning to feel fear. He couldn't articulate why. The deaths could be explained as accidents and misfortune. But something in his gut told him there was a pattern. Something happening on his plantation he couldn't understand or control. He began carrying a loaded pistol, doubled the patrols, and ordered overseers to work in pairs. On August 12, 1833, exactly 1 year after purchasing Daniel, Whitfield made a decision. He called his estate manager and ordered Daniel sold, without explaining his reasoning. Better to be rid of him at a loss than keep him and risk whatever instinct was screaming that this particular slave was dangerous. On August 20, 1833, Daniel was taken in chains back to Richmond and sold at auction for $875. The buyer was a cotton planter from North Carolina, Benjamin Garrett, who operated a massive estate called Thornhill. Garrett had come to Richmond specifically for strong field hands. Cotton was booming, and endless demand from English textile mills promised a fortune. He examined Daniel on the block, checked his teeth, felt his arms and shoulders, and had him walk, bend, and demonstrate his strength. Daniel complied without expression, his face a mask of docile obedience. Garrett saw what he wanted: a strong worker, worth the investment. The chains went back on, and Daniel was loaded into a wagon with 6 others for the 200-mile journey south to Thornhill, a 5-day trip through late summer heat. Thornhill was larger than Ashford, nearly 5,000 acres of cotton fields worked by 280 enslaved people under 9 overseers. The operation was more sophisticated, more profitable, and more brutal. Cotton demanded a different set of backbreaking labors: planting, chopping weeds, picking with bleeding hands, and ginning and baling the harvest. Daniel arrived on August 25, 1833, and was assigned to the second gang. He received his clothing, tools, and sleeping space. And for 2 months, he did exactly what he had done at Ashford: worked in silence, learned the layout, memorized the routines, and identified vulnerabilities in Thornhill's security. He studied the overseers, learning which were cruel, which were indifferent, and which posed the greatest threat to those around him. He chose his targets with care. On October 31, 1833, an overseer named Richard Sloane was found dead in his bed. Sloane was one of Thornhill's cruelest, infamous for creative punishments. He'd once forced a man to dig his own grave, and then stand in it for 12 hours, and he'd beaten pregnant women and separated families for minor infractions. He was both feared and hated. His body was discovered by another overseer when he failed to appear for morning roll call. He lay in his bed in the overseer's quarters, his face purple, his tongue protruding, his eyes bulging and bloodshot. The plantation physician, a Dr. Mund, ruled it a natural death, possibly a stroke or seizure during sleep. But Sloane's pillow showed deep creases, as if something had been pressed down hard over his face, and his door, which should have been locked, was unlocked. Someone had entered while he slept, suffocated him with his own pillow, arranged the scene, and left without being seen or heard by any of the other 5 overseers sleeping in the same building. 2 months later, on December 28, 1833, another overseer, Francis Drummond, vanished. He'd been riding the property boundary on horseback when his horse returned without him at dusk, reins dangling. Search parties found nothing: no body, no signs of struggle. Drummond simply ceased to exist. In February 1834, an overseer named Caleb Thornton died when his horse allegedly threw him during morning rounds, breaking his neck. But his horse was gentle and well trained, and there were cuts on the saddle girth that looked deliberate, as if someone had partially severed the leather. 3 overseers dead or missing in 4 months. Benjamin Garrett was terrified. He increased security, armed all overseers, installed additional patrols, and questioned the enslaved workers brutally. He found nothing. No one admitted seeing anything. No one offered information. The wall of silence was absolute. So on April 3, 1834, just as Marcus Whitfield had done, Garrett decided to sell Daniel. He couldn't prove Daniel was involved, but something about this particular slave made him deeply uncomfortable. The way Daniel observed everything, the way he moved with confidence that didn't match his status, the way others watched him when they thought no one was looking. Daniel was sold again, then again and again. Between 1834 and 1840, Daniel, or whatever his real name was sold 12 times, across 12 different plantations in 5 states. At every location, within months of his arrival, white men involved in the slave system began dying. The pattern was always the same: Daniel would arrive, work quietly, learn the terrain and the people, and then the deaths would start. Overseers found dead in circumstances that could be explained as accidents or natural causes. Slave catchers who disappeared while tracking runaways, plantation managers who drowned in shallow water, county officials who died in their sleep from unexplained causes. And always, Daniel would be there, quiet, unremarkable, invisible in plain sight, until the planter's nerve broke, and he sold Daniel to someone else, passing along the problem. The enslaved communities recognized what was happening. They understood Daniel was executing a specific campaign. He targeted the cruelest overseers first, then slave catchers, then plantation managers, then merchants and traders. He was systematic and patient, never taking unnecessary risks, never killing unless the opportunity was perfect, and never leaving evidence that could be traced back to him with certainty. Stories began spreading through the underground networks that connected enslaved people across the South. Stories of a man who moved from plantation to plantation, leaving a trail of dead white men. They gave him names: Moses, the angel, the shadow, the ghost. He was death to slaveholders and hope to the enslaved. By 1840, plantation owners across the Deep South began noticing a disturbing pattern. In private clubs and drawing rooms, over brandy and cigars, they discussed too many overseers dying, too many slave catchers disappearing. Some started comparing notes, pulling out ledgers and auction records, tracing sales and transfers. A few began to see something that made their blood run cold: a slave who'd been sold an unusual number of times. A man appearing in records of multiple plantations where unexplained deaths had occurred. They couldn't prove it, but the pattern was there. In January 1841, a group of wealthy planters in Charleston pooled resources to hire a private investigator, a former Pinkerton named Amos Fairchild. They gave him access to records and told him to identify the killer. Fairchild was methodical. After 4 months of reviewing documents and interviewing plantation owners, he submitted a 47-page report in May 1841, documenting 89 deaths fitting a specific profile. He traced an individual through 12 sales, 14 plantations, and 5 states. His conclusion was stark: "Gentlemen, you have been harboring a serial killer, an enslaved man of remarkable intelligence and patience who has been systematically murdering white men for nearly a decade. Based on the evidence, I estimate his actual death toll may exceed 100 individuals." He recommended immediate action to locate and execute the man. But there was a problem. By May 1841, Daniel had disappeared again. His last recorded sale had been in March 1841 to an Alabama plantation. But when authorities arrived, he was gone. A massive manhunt spanning 3 states offered a $100,000 reward and distributed descriptions across the South. For 6 months, nothing. Daniel had vanished. Then, in November 1841, a slave trader was found strangled with a chain in a locked warehouse in Mobile, Alabama, while 20 enslaved people were found unchained and gone. 1 week later, an overseer in Mississippi was suffocated with his pillow. 2 weeks after that, a slave catcher in Louisiana drowned in 18 inches of water. The message was clear: the manhunt had failed. Daniel was still hunting. Between 1842 and 1850, the situation escalated. Daniel stopped staying at plantations long enough to be sold, instead moving through the South using the networks enslaved people had created. He would appear at a plantation, work for a few weeks, identify targets, strike, and vanish along routes no white person could trace. The deaths became more brazen. In March 1842, a notorious slave catcher was found with his throat slit in his own home, a small wooden cross left on his chest. In July 1843, a cruel plantation owner was stabbed in the back in the middle of a crowded county fair in Georgia, the killer disappearing into the crowd. In December 1844, an entire slave patrol of 4 armed men vanished in the Louisiana swamps, their bodies never recovered. Authorities were desperate. Fairchild was hired again with a larger team and bigger rewards, but the wall of silence held. Even under brutal torture, not a single enslaved person gave up information. The solidarity was absolute, and it terrified slave owners more than the deaths themselves. It meant their system had a fundamental vulnerability. By 1846, the psychological impact was so profound that a South Carolina minister named Reverend Thomas Ashford published a letter admitting he'd been visited by the man they were hunting. The man, calm and articulate, explained he was executing justice, only killing those who had committed extreme cruelty, and warned Ashford to change his ways. Ashford was so shaken he freed his slaves and sold his plantation. The death toll climbed. Fairchild's 1848 estimate reached 187 confirmed deaths, with dozens more possible. The killings were spreading geographically, from Texas to Maryland, from Tennessee to Florida, whether by Daniel or by copycats inspired by his methods. The authorities couldn't tell, and that was terrifying because the resistance was becoming a movement. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, Daniel saw it as an opportunity. Between 1850 and 1853, several U.S. Marshals enforcing the act died under suspicious circumstances. One with a broken neck in a Boston alley, another who disappeared in Pennsylvania, a third poisoned in Ohio. The federal government became involved, but a task force failed completely. The killings continued. By 1855, the estimated death toll had exceeded 200. Fairchild, exhausted, submitted his final report, admitting defeat. This individual, or these individuals, have created a form of warfare our system cannot counter. Unless the institution of slavery is reformed or eliminated, these deaths will continue. The report was suppressed, but privately, planters understood its implications. Some moderated their treatment of slaves, others doubled down on brutality. Neither worked. Then, in 1857, the killing stopped. No deaths matching the profile were reported for months. Some believed Daniel had died or escaped north. Others thought he was preparing for something larger. The nation was splitting apart, war was coming, and some believed Moses was positioning himself for that war. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected, and within months, the Civil War began. In the chaos, the pattern continued. Confederate officers dying in their tents, slave catchers found dead under inexplicable circumstances, plantation owners dying far from battle lines, but the deaths were attributed to the war. In 1863, a Union officer in occupied New Orleans wrote of Confederate sympathizers dying at an unusual rate, but the freed population wouldn't speak of it. Similar reports came from other occupied territories. A Union chaplain named Reverend Samuel Norton interviewed dozens of freed slaves in 1864, compiling stories of a figure they called the angel, the deliverer, the shadow of justice, Moses. One elderly woman, Clara, said, "We knew that justice delayed ain't justice denied. We knew some angels carry vengeance." Norton's manuscript was never published. The Civil War ended in April 1865. In the chaos of Reconstruction, the records and infrastructure of the slave system collapsed, and the man known as Daniel disappeared from history. But fragments remain. A denied pension application from 1867 by a man claiming to be 63 and describing irregular operations behind enemy lines. A letter in 1870 from a Freedmen's Bureau officer about an elderly teacher in Georgia who read Latin and Greek was called Moses, and then vanished, and a 1935 oral history from a 94-year-old woman in Charleston who recalled a man in 1872 who told her he'd stopped counting after 200 kills, his soul burdened but unrepentant. He told her, "I became the consequence they couldn't avoid." He left the next morning and was never seen again. The interview ends there. No death record exists. The trail ends without proof. What remains is a mystery wrapped in legend, buried in historical amnesia. The story of Daniel Moses, or whatever his name was, challenges our comfortable narratives. It reveals that enslaved people weren't passive victims. They had agency and fought back, and the slaveholders lived in fear because of it. The documented evidence is undeniable. Between 1832 and 1865, over 200 white men involved in the slave system died under suspicious circumstances. Investigators recognized the pattern and failed to capture the perpetrator. The enslaved communities maintained absolute silence because they viewed the killings not as crimes, but as justice. This story matters because it changes how we understand that period of history, transforming the enslaved from victims into agents of their own liberation. It doesn't matter if Daniel was one man or many, if the death toll was 250 or 150. The fundamental truth is that enslaved people resisted, and their resistance was effective. This history deserves to be told, even when it's uncomfortable. The story of Moses, the angel of death who moved through the antebellum South, is part of American history, buried in archives and oral traditions, ignored by historians because it doesn't fit the comfortable story we want to tell about ourselves. But ignoring uncomfortable history doesn't make it less true. So let me ask you this. Do you believe one man could have done this? Could someone wage a 30-year war against a system that enslaved millions? Could the enslaved communities maintain that level of secrecy? Or is this a myth, a story created to give hope? What do you think happened to Daniel after the Civil War? Tell me in the comments. And if you think this story deserves to be heard, share this video. Subscribe to Litany of Shadows for more stories from the shadows of history. Hit that notification bell, because next week I'm bringing you another mystery that historians tried to bury. Another story that will change how you see America's past. Remember, history is never as simple as they teach you in school. The truth is always more complex, more disturbing, and more powerful than the sanitized version. Sometimes the heroes were violent, sometimes justice came from unexpected places. That's the real story of the slave who eliminated 250 white men and was never seen again. A story of what oppression creates, of resistance in its rawest form, and a story America would rather forget, but which refuses to stay buried. See you in the next one.